and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Rose Lucibello, Manager of Advancement Events at York University. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture titled Daylight Saving Time, It's Time to Get Rid of It, presented by Dr. Patricia Lakin-Thomas, Professor in the Department of Biology, Faculty of Science. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I am on. Because we may not be gathered in the same place, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory you are on. Please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on. The website nativeland.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, we would like to conduct a quick poll before each session begins. The question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? The poll should pop up on your screen right now. I'll give everyone a moment to respond. Thank you. It's helpful for our speakers to know more about who is in our audience. If you need help with Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Our team is ready to help you. That same button may be used to submit questions to our guest speaker during the Q&A period. Please note that all of your questions and comments are visible to the panelists and staff working behind the scenes, and we ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Patricia Lakin-Thomas. Dr. Lakin-Thomas, or Dr. Pat, as she is known to her students, is a professor in the biology department at York University. She earned her PhD in biology at the University of California, San Diego, then worked as a researcher and lecturer at the University of Cambridge before coming to York University in 2002. She currently teaches courses in cell biology and circadian timing and runs the Clock Lab, where she and her students study the molecular mechanisms that allow living things to tell time. We're so pleased you could make the time to join us today. Welcome, Dr. Pat.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I will share my slides. So the topic, daylight saving time, it's time to get rid of it. So I guess you know where I stand right at the beginning. I'd like to start with another poll. So I'm hoping they can put this one up. How do you feel after the recent time change, which happened over this weekend? You barely noticed it? Or you think your sleep schedule was off for a few days? Or maybe you felt like you had really bad jet lag for several days. Okay, it looks like people can feel, we're going to share the results. People can feel that they were a bit off for a few days. Some of us barely notice it, and maybe a couple of people really feel bad, like they had it for several days. Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to do a second poll, which is my next slide. So, what do you want to do about daylight saving time? Do you want to keep the current system of time changes? You like springing forward and falling back? Or you'd like to abolish it, but keep daylight saving time year round, which is summertime? Or you'd like to abolish the changes, but keep standard time, which is winter time year round? Or you don't really know, you'd like to have more information to make a judgment. Okay, that's interesting. So you're going to share those results. We have about an equal split between all of those. That's quite interesting. Okay, thank you very much. We can end the polls. So this is the outline of what I'd like to tell you about today. We're going to do a little bit of history. How did we get where we are today? What's the history of DST? And what are these proposals to go year-round DST, daylight saving time? To explain what's happening to us, we need to talk about the 3 o'clock problem and a little bit of astronomy of timekeeping. We're going to talk about the biology of circadian rhythms in humans and why sunrise is important to us, and some of the problems that we have with daylight saving time. So we're going to look at short-term problems and we're going to look at long-term problems. And finally, just wrap it up with what the recommendations are from the best available science. So what's the history of this? How did we get started with this? Well, there was a British builder and golfer named William Willett, who in 1905 proposed daylight saving time because he wanted more daylight hours in the summer to go out golfing. Now, interestingly, the first place in the world to adopt it, the first city, was actually in Ontario, Port Arthur, which is now Thunder Bay, in 1908. In World War I, 1916, Germany and Austria-Hungary adopted it. They said it would save coal, and it was followed by other countries, but then it was all abandoned after the war. World War II, some countries adopted it again and then dropped it after the war. In the 1970s, daylight saving time was adopted to save energy during the energy crisis. This is where we are right now as far as the global status. Just to point out that most of the world doesn't bother with daylight saving time. This is kind of a North American and European thing, and some places in the world have tried it and abandoned it. So we are in the minority in following this practice. Now, people have proposed going year-round instead of switching twice a year. And what are some of the arguments that they bring up for why this would be a good idea? The original arguments were that you get more leisure time. So, like going golfing in the afternoon daylight. During World War I and World War II and the 1970s energy crisis, they were giving the argument that it was energy savings. Now, people have looked at this carefully. They've looked at the data, and whether you save energy or not depends on where you are, your location, the kind of climate you have, the kind of economy you have. Some places you might save some energy on lighting. Other times you're going to burn more energy for heating. We don't find consistent savings, so this isn't really a good argument for daylight saving time and certainly not for year-round daylight saving time. In Ontario, a bill has been passed, which is called the Economic Stimulus Plan for COVID-19 Recovery. And their argument was as follows, that there'd be more daylight in the evening and it would generate economic activity. Individuals are more likely to go out shopping after work if it's still light out. So when governments are proposing to stop switching twice a year and go to year-round daylight saving time, we have to ask ourselves, do we really think more shopping is a good idea? How important is it to get a little bit of golf in the afternoon? We need to balance that against the negatives. People have tried year-round daylight saving time. There are some places that use it now. Saskatchewan has been on year-round daylight saving time for a number of decades. Yukon, just a few years ago, went to year-round daylight saving time, and there are other places in the world that are on year-round DST as well. In the US, they tried it during the energy crisis for a couple of years. Now, before the change, if you ask the public, 79% of the public said, that sounds great. Let's go to year-round daylight saving time. After the first winter, they did the poll again, and only 42% were in favor. So it's that winter time that really shows people that this is not something they want to do. It was tried in Russia for a few years, 2011 to 2014, and again, people complained about the late sunrise in the winter, and they went back to standard time year-round. UK and Ireland tried it for a few years. They went back to the twice yearly switching. So it has not been a successful experiment in most of the places that have tried it. Well, why not? What is it that it's doing to us that makes it so hard? To understand that, we have to know that our lives are controlled by 3 clocks. So we have this 3 clock problem. We have the solar time, that's the sunrise. And we need that to reset our body clock. I'll kind of come back to that. Our body clock is our circadian system, and I'm going to come back to that, give you some more details about that. This is genetically determined. It's part of our functioning body that is reset by light. We need light. Then there's the social time, and that's the clock on the wall or your wrist or your phone clock. That is society's demands on our behavior. We have to get up a certain time, we have to go to work, we have to go to school. We talk about social jet lag, and that means the mismatch between our biological clock and our social clock when they don't match up. Let's look at a bit of astronomy. What's going on with the solar clock? This is the sun graph for Toronto, our local location, my location at least. And we are right here at March the 13th. We have just passed daylight saving time. So this is plotted according to social time. And it's showing you the times of sunrise and the times of sunset. And there's this big break here because that's when we switched our social clock so that the sun is now rising later than it was before, and the sun is setting later than it was before. But notice that during daylight saving time that we're on now, solar noon, that is when the sun is at the highest point of the sky, is not when our social clock says it's noon. Ideally, we would like those two things to match. Right now, they're off by almost an hour and a half in Toronto. So what happens with our sunrise and sunset times? Under standard time, what we really want to focus on is what's going to happen in the winter. Standard time sunrise, about 7:48. Under daylight saving time, if we did this year round, Toronto wouldn't see the sun until almost 9 a.m. That's after workers have gone to work and are inside their offices or inside their jobs. It's after kids are in school. They've gone to work in the dark. We won't see it. And if you live further north, of course, it's going to rise even later in the midwinter if you're on year-round daylight saving time. Well, why does that matter? Let's take a look at what's going on in our body and our body clocks. I study chronobiology, which means the study of biological time. And we talk about circadian time. Circadian means about a day, circa dies. These are rhythms with periods of about 24 hours. And this is a fundamental property of cells. We find these rhythms in almost all eukaryotes, which means things bigger than bacteria, and also in some prokaryotes that are bacteria. This is what I actually study in my lab. This is my fungus, Neurospora crassa, and it's making a spore-forming rhythm. We start it in the middle of the plate, and it grows out, and it makes a band of spores once a day. So this is a fundamental property of most life on Earth, really. What's going on in humans? Here's our circadian system. Now I'm going to break this down into the parts, but we want to look at the whole, that we have light coming in through the eye, going to the brain where there's a central clock, and sending output to all the parts of the body, and they all have their own clocks. So let's look at each of those parts. Looking at the central clock in the brain, we have a little cluster of cells that's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it's in the hypothalamus of the brain. This is our central clock. Now it can run on its own. It doesn't need any cues from the environment. It's just intrinsically rhythmic. It keeps time by itself. And it will drive other things in the brain. So rhythms that control your sleeping and waking, your appetite, your mood, and your thinking ability, your cognition. It sends output to the rest of the body through the autonomic nervous system, and that means the nerves, and also the neuroendocrine system, which means hormones. So the nervous system and hormones are controlling what goes on in the rest of the body. We synchronize this with the day-night cycle because input comes from the light hitting the eyes. We have a set of cells at the back of the retina called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. That's a mouthful. They aren't the rods and cones that give you vision, interestingly, a separate set of cells that's just there to tell us how much light's in the environment. It resets the central clock in the brain. It's mainly sensitive to blue light. Now, our SCN, our central clock, runs a little bit slow, and so every day we need to reset it with light from the eyes. Down here in the periphery, which means the organs outside the brain, we have physiological rhythms in pretty much everything in the body. We've got rhythms of hormone levels, body temperature, our feeding and fasting rhythms that are controlled by the brain. Uh, they cause rhythms in blood pressure, blood glucose, triglycerides. You have an insulin rhythm. We have rhythms of xenobiotic clearance, which means clearing out toxins from the kidneys. So practically everything in the body is rhythmic. This is what it should look like when everything's in sync. We know our physiology and metabolism are rhythmic. And for example, here's your body temperature rhythm dropping at night, and then it starts to rise about the time you wake up. Here's the rhythm of cortisol, very important hormone. We call it the stress hormone, but it should be rising just about the time, a steep rise when you wake up, getting you ready for the day. We have rhythms in other hormones like melatonin, which is high at night, and it should be dropping when you wake up. Here's our social clock telling us to wake up at dawn. Ideally, this is the sun at sunrise. These are well synchronized rhythms. But things can get out of whack. What happens when our brain clock and our body clocks get out of step with each other? They need to be synchronized. The brain will be reset by light. It resets very fast, but then it has to send those cues to the rest of the body to reset the peripheral clocks. And that is kind of slow. To get your liver and your guts and your heart reset can take some time. You feel this when you have jet lag, internal desynchrony. You fly across a time zone, your brain is resetting very fast to the local time, but those peripheral clocks out in your organs, they take about a day per hour of time change to get back in step with what your brain is doing. But because you're in the local time zone, the sun is going to reset your clock and the rest of your body can eventually catch up. You'll be disrupted for a while, and that's what gives you the symptoms of jet lag, but you get over it because you're now in a new time zone with a new sun cycle. People who are on shift work, though, it's like having jet lag all the time. It has negative effects on sleep and mood and performance, and they have increased risk of all of these chronic diseases, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, because they just can't ever get back in step. So if we go to daylight saving time, what's happening? Here's our sun time telling us to get up, and it's synchronizing our body clock. The body clock needs the sun, but here our social clock is telling us we have to get up earlier, and we're not synchronized with what should be going on in the body. If we're getting up too early, our stress hormone hasn't started to rise yet to get us ready for the day. Our body temperature is still a little bit too low. Other hormones aren't where they should be. And your body isn't ready to face the stress of the day. That Tim Hortons donut you're going to buy on the way to work isn't going to have the right insulin levels to deal with the sugar rush. So you're going to be out of sorts and your physiology isn't going to be ready for what you're hitting it with. So what is it that's so important about the sunrise? Sunrise is very important to humans. Our clock, as I mentioned, is a bit slow. Our period, if we don't have any time cues from the environment, is a little longer than 24 hours. We need the morning light to push us earlier. We need to push our clocks earlier every day. If we get light in the evening, it pushes our clocks later, and that's worse because it's already a bit slow. So we have slow clocks. We need that morning light to reset us every day. And the human brain, resets to that morning light to the sunrise. Now, this seems kind of surprising. It did to me when I first looked at the data. I thought, well, we just all live under electric lights, right? I'm sure we all just ignore what's going on outside in the sun. Well, it turns out there's really good data that we actually do follow the sunrise. So here's some data on that. This was an experiment that was done in Germany. This is a map of Germany. It just shows a cluster of where people answered this questionnaire. They gave people a very simple questionnaire across Germany, and they said, what time do you like to fall asleep? And what time do you like to wake up if you don't have to wake up with an alarm? And then they just calculate the middle of that. It's called the mid-sleep time. And all those points are on this graph show you the mid-sleep time all across Germany. So this is the longitude from west to east across the country. The shaded area shows you what the sun does. The sun rises in the east earlier, and it's about an hour later before it gets to the other side of Germany. They're all in one time zone. People in the people in the west see the sun later. The shaded part shows you what time people see the sun. The dots show you what time people prefer to sleep. Look at that. The sleep follows the sun. It follows it very closely. So even though they're all living in an industrial society with lots of electric lights, people are still trying to follow the sun when they have a choice, when they can get up whenever they like. So let's talk about daylight saving time. What are the problems with it? There are two things that we have to separate, two issues. We've got short-term effects, which happen when we switch in the fall and the spring. We've got long-term effects that we can expect from year-round daylight saving time if we were to go to that. Short-term effects are acute things, sudden things that are like health episodes and accidents. We'll look at some data in a minute. They're worse in the spring than the fall. They're going to last a few days after the switch. And it's probably because we're losing an hour of sleep at the switch in the spring. And it's like having short-term jet lag. We're going to look at some long-term effects, increases in chronic disease and decreases in productivity and income, probably because of long-term circadian desynchronization. And we actually have some suggestions from data that this could happen if we go to long-term daylight saving time. So this is just a list of some of the studies that have been done looking at the annual time switching. What happens when we spring ahead in the spring? And these are various publications that have been looking at the data. We have increased rates of car accidents, increased heart attacks, increased rates and severity of workplace injuries, increased rates of stroke. There's even one study that says judges will give harsher sentences to convicted criminals in a few days after the time change. So the judges are a bit cranky, probably because they've lost some sleep and they're feeling kind of jet lagged. The fall back seems to be a lot easier. When we turn the clocks back in the fall, we actually gain an hour of sleep, and everybody can use another hour of sleep. And we're moving our body clocks closer to solar time when we fall back in the fall, so we don't have this jet lag problem. So those are the short-term impacts that we are beginning to know a lot more about that happen twice a year, or at least they happen mostly in the spring with the switch. Now let's look at what might happen for long-term effects. We don't have data from places that actually have year-round daylight saving time. What we do have is a very clever experiment. It's actually a natural experiment that's going on right now with time zones, with some scientists who looked at the data across a time zone. So can 1 hour really make a difference? It seems like it shouldn't, but we can see in the data it actually does. So here's the experiment. We're going to look at the time of sunset across a time zone. So the data came from the United States Health Statistics. They have this time zone. If we just focus on this one time zone, this is the time of sunset. So the sun sets earlier in the east, and then the sun moves to the west, and the sun sets later in the west. Now, let's look at that same map. And what they did is they collected health statistics from people who live right along a border of those two time zones. These are people who live close to each other. They have similar lifestyles, similar environments. Your neighbor, though, might have set their social clock an hour apart from you because they just happen to live on the other side of the time zone border. So they collected health data for the people on either side of the time zone borders and looked at the results. This is the map we saw before, showing you the sunset time getting later and later as you go across a time zone. Bedtime follows the sun time, not the social time. This is bedtime. They go to bed early on the east side and they go to bed late on the west side of a time zone. Well, that means the people on the west side, they want to go to bed later because the sunset is later. But everybody in the time zone has to get up at the same time, and they are losing sleep. They're losing about 19 minutes of sleep per night on the west side. That really adds up. Think about that across a week. You're going to be pretty sleep deprived by the end of the week just because of where you live in a time zone. Now, they looked at the health impacts on either side of a time zone. So comparing people on the west side to the people on the east side, when you see the sun later, you're going to bed later, you're missing out on the sleep, you're a bit social jet lagged, you're 11% more likely to be overweight, 21% more likely to be obese, 19% increase in the rate of heart attacks, increases in the rates of diabetes, even increases in cancer rates. They could even find a change in income. People on the west side of a time zone were losing 3% of their income per capita, maybe due to absenteeism, maybe due to the sleep loss and the poor health that they had. So just 1 hour difference in a time zone can make all of those effects. So imagine now that we put the whole population another hour out of step by going to year-round daylight saving time. The effects that that would have on the population would be measurable. So who is it who would be impacted by year-round daylight saving time? If we do this, let's think about the summer. People like those late summer sunsets, maybe. You get leisure time, you get shopping time, but think about the families. If you have tried to put your kids to bed when it's still light on a summer evening, you know how hard that is. We like to stay up late on a summer evening, but then we're losing sleep because we still have our social clock telling us we have to get up early, go to work, go to school. What about those dark winter mornings? This is the thing that has really killed all the previous experiments with daylight saving time. Parents trying to get kids to school on those very dark mornings. Essential workers who have to get up early, go to their minimum wage jobs in the dark, and the health impacts it can have on them. So thinking about the balance between maybe some advantages of daylight saving time year round and the big disadvantages, these are the policy recommendations that those of us who work in the field of circadian rhythms are suggesting to governments. We're strongly advocating we should scrap the time changes. We all know about the disruption from the twice yearly switching. We advocate for standard time, that's winter time, year round, not daylight saving time, because under standard time year round, the sun clock is going to be closer to our social clock. Our bodies, which set our time to the sun, are going to be closer to our social activities when we have to get up, go to work, go to school. Our body clocks are going to be better synchronized, and we hope that will lead to better health for the whole population. So we're going to end by putting up that poll again. My last slide will be our poll. Let's see what happens if we put up the poll again. Do you want to keep the current system of changes, springing forward, falling back? Do you want to abolish it and go to daylight saving time year round? Do you want to abolish it and go to standard time, or you still feel like you don't have enough information to make a judgment? Okay, let's see what happens with this poll. It looks like we're about there. Let's try ending that poll and sharing the results. Wow, look at that. Okay, it looks like I convinced a lot of you. We're going to abolish the time changes and keep standard time. Great, thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you so much, Dr. Pat, for that very timely and informative talk. And just for the audience, we now have some time for questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. And for those of you watching live on Facebook, you're free to submit any questions or comments through the comment section for the video. So that was a very great presentation. I have to say, when you mentioned for parents with children, I thought of myself this weekend. We had a rough transition into the week because that time change can really it really does something to us, and especially small people who, they don't really understand it, right? So that was very timely indeed, this talk. And so while we wait for some of the audience to submit questions, I'll start by asking you one to get started. So what can we do to make adapting to the time change easier while it is still, in play right now?
Right. Well, ideally, you would try to ease into it, like going to bed 15 minutes earlier every day for a few days. That's pretty hard to implement. After the time change, give yourself some extra time. See if you can not do it in one sudden hour leap and just kind of ease into it. Get out in the morning and get some morning light. Try to get yourself awake and going with some of that good morning light. That helps too.
Mhm. How about vitamin D? I'm just wondering, if you take vitamin D, does it help or is there not?
I haven't heard anything about that.
Okay.
No, no, I don't know anything about that.
So one of our questions from an audience member is, could daylight saving time impact a woman's fertility or overall menstrual cycle, in your opinion?
Ooh, that's a great question. So the interaction between circadian cycles and menstrual cycles, and I'm not an expert on that. Um, I would just say that we have daily rhythms in all of our hormone levels. There's nothing that's constant in the body, and the hormone levels that influence our fertility and our menstrual cycles are certainly going to be circadian controlled as well. I haven't seen any studies on impacts on fertility, but my guess is you probably will see something because all the hormones have daily cycles as well as monthly cycles.
Mhm. Very interesting. Another question from Heather in our audience. Is there data on such negative long-term effects in the places you mentioned that have stayed on the permanent DST? So Yukon, Saskatoon,
Yeah.
um,
I wish we had some data, and we don't. We are really lacking it. I would like some of my colleagues who work on humans. I work on fungus, not humans. I would like some of my colleagues to collect some data. Um, at this point, we're really lacking, and we're also lacking data from northern latitudes. And Canada should be doing more to find out what's going on with people who live further north than Toronto.
mhm,
It's a big hole in our data and in our understanding. Saskatchewan's been doing this for a very long time, although some places have actually been doing daylight saving time without realizing it. Alberta, for example, when you look at where the time zones are located, Alberta is actually located pretty far to the west of the time zone it's supposed to be in.
mm,
They're already almost all of Alberta is like an hour out from their supposed time zone, and they're going to be even further out if they go year round. Um, but we don't have the data. We really need more data on this.
mhm. Next question. Considering that we need sunrise to reset our body clock, is there any danger in using room darkening shades in our bedroom? This is from a retiree who doesn't really need to get up, at a specific time, but still wondering the effect.
Danger in room darkening? Absolutely not. Room darkening is wonderful. I have room darkening shades in my bedroom as well, definitely.
Mhm,
Keeping your bedroom dark with darkened shades while you're sleeping is really important. We need the darkness as much as we need the light.
mhm,
Um, we've been hearing more and more, for example, about the dangers of sitting up in bed with your blue light emitting screens. All of those cell phones, tablets, laptops emit a lot of blue light. And if you noticed when I was talking about resetting your clock with light through the eyes, and that we have these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which I like
mhm,
saying,
mhm,
they are very sensitive to blue light. And you're resetting your circadian clock when you sit up in bed with blue light emitting screens, and
mhm,
you're going to be pushing your clock later. You're going to be awake later, trying to stay up later because your clock is getting reset to a later time. Then you try to get up in the morning and your clock isn't ready for it. Your body clock isn't ready. So dark at night in your bedroom, keep the blue light away, use those darkening shades, definitely, especially in the summer when it is going to have light in the morning earlier than we want to get up. Room darkening shades will help you a lot to synchronize with when you want to get up and open the shades and give yourself an artificial sunrise.
Hmm. Again, speaking as a parent to a young child, that is exactly what I had to do, especially last summer when he became much more aware that the daylight was still outside when I was trying to get him to sleep. So I totally agree
Okay.
with the shadings.
Okay.
Another person from the audience said, I voted for standard time year round. How would this impact our dealings with the US?
That's an argument that is always made by governments. Now, Ontario, for example, passed this law in 2020 to go to year-round daylight saving time, the wrong direction, of course, but not until neighboring jurisdictions did, not until New York, Quebec do it. I don't understand the argument. It's as if we cannot speak to people in Manitoba because they're on a different time zone. Well, of course we can. We do business
Mhm.
across time zone borders all the time. We can communicate with people in other time zones. So I don't understand the argument at all. Um, we're doing it all the time. We can conduct business with other time zones with no problem. I don't get it, frankly.
Yeah, and piggybacking onto that, someone else did ask as well about our dealings, I guess, outside of North America with other places who don't use daylight savings time. So I suppose I guess the same answer would probably
We're
apply to
talking to
that.
people in every time zone all the time. Yeah, we're conducting business with Europe and China and
Mhm.
many different time zones with no problem at all.
Another question from Terry from our audience is, could permanently adjusting the social clock make year-round DST workable? So in other words, could we all agree to start work and school later?
Yes. But what's the point? um, you starting school later is a great idea. Just I'll throw this in as an extra bit of information that we know that teenagers in particular, their body clocks run later than young children or adults. If your teenager doesn't want to get up in the morning, don't blame them. Blame their biology because their biological clock actually lets them need to sleep later. They have to
Mhm.
sleep later. And if you start school later, they're actually going to do better. They're going to be less tardy. They'll even get higher grades. If there's some studies from the US where they delay school start times.
Wow.
Um, but you know, the ideal thing to do is to just say we're all going to start our schools, start our shops opening, start our businesses at a reasonable time that is a couple of hours after sunrise, so everybody's been able to get up at sunrise and get ready and commute to work. That would be the ideal thing to do. You'd have to change it though across the time zones. It'd be different opening times, a little further west from you or a little further east.
Mhm.
There's no ideal solution. It There are trade-offs in every case, but the standard time year round has the fewest bad trade-offs.
Very interesting. Um, so the next question is from Heather. So she's asking, are the effects any different when people live in an area that tends to be dark and overcast a lot, like Pacific Northwest, as
Mm.
opposed to a sunny area like the prairies? Or do we just need a general sense of light rather than full sunlight?
I don't think the full sunlight matters. It's surprisingly bright even under dark skies compared to what you get indoors. Because our vision is very good at adapting to light levels, when we walk inside, we adapt to that light level until it feels like it's bright. But if
Mhm.
you go around with an actual light meter and measure the light levels, you'll be shocked at how dark it actually is inside, even under the best lighting conditions that we have indoors. Overcast days are much brighter outside than even a bright interior. So it doesn't really matter if it's full sun or cloudiness.
Another question, wondering what daylight saving time, should it be good for farmers? Like, what is the effect on that industry?
Um, Farmers, yes. There is this rumor going around that daylight saving time was started by farmers or is good for farmers. Farmers don't like daylight saving time. Farmers and their animals and their plants follow the sun.
Mm,
The cows are going to get up according to a solar time. And farmers can actually have problems with daylight saving if, for example, their customers want that milk delivery at a certain time, and now the customer's social clock has switched, but the cows aren't awake yet. The farmer can't wake up the cows. They're
mm.
going to wake up with the sun. So farmers don't like it most of the time. I mean, they're ignoring the social clock. They're going according to the solar clock, which is what their animals and their plants are following.
Another question is, have you examined the lands of midnight sun, dark
Mm,
winters?
mm. It all becomes kind of a moot point. The further north you go, they have such an extreme time change to deal with such very long days in the summer and very long nights in the winter. That's a whole other class of problem. Whether they're switching 1 hour or not with daylight saving time doesn't make much of a difference.
Mhm.
So this is a problem really of kind of the middle latitude temperate regions. It doesn't matter either at the equator. You don't have much of a difference between the seasons. So people in the north are dealing with a much bigger issue that kind of swamps out any effects of daylight saving time, really.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about, but I know on the west coast of Canada, the sun sets so late in the summertime. And so I was actually thinking about like how did that, impact how that impacts like this daylight savings time. It doesn't really make a difference if the sun goes down at 10:30 p.m.,
Well, that
you
depends
know?
on the time zone that you're in. That's why
Hmm.
we divided the Earth up into some time zones so that
Hmm.
supposedly the sun should be overhead in the middle of your time zone at noon. That's the ideal, the way the lines were originally drawn across the globe.
Hmm.
Um, when we're messing around with daylight saving time, we're switching ourselves away from that. And some places, those lines aren't drawn very well. For example, Alberta, the line is drawn uh, far away from where Alberta actually is, according to that time zone. So it gets messed up in various places where people don't follow the ideal lines or they do some daylight saving time switching.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pat, for joining us today and for taking part in our Scholars Hub conversation. This was very interesting, and we're really appreciative to have had you today. Thank you
My
so much.
pleasure.
You're welcome to now turn off your video. For the audience, we have one more poll question. How would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following this discussion? It should pop up on your screen right now. Great. Thank you so much. Scholars Hub will be back next week on Wednesday, March 20th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Join us for the lecture titled Unpacking and Understanding the Importance to an Land Acknowledgement. It is Not Just a Script by Dr. Ruth Green, Associate Professor and Special Advisor to the Dean's Office on Indigenous Issues in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. To register for that event and learn more about upcoming sessions, please visit yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Thank you and be well.